My first three books really covered a decade, basically. I arrived in China to live in 1996, and I lived there until 2007. So those three books cover that decade. It's a very sort of specific and kind of a special moment. That was when the economy was booming, lots of migration. The factory economy was sort of central to China. So it was a very specific moment in Chinese history. I mean, when I arrived in China in 1996 as a teacher, almost all of my students had come from the countryside. At that time, most Chinese had been born in the countryside. And by the time I taught in 2019, my first semester, I didn't have one student who would come from the countryside. China had become majority urban country, and the students I taught were mostly only children from one-child families, middle class, so a very different country, really. I returned in 2019. That was a little more than 20 years after I first came to China, so it was basically a generation later. In a very different era. I mean, this was, Xi Jinping's China, right? So it's a different era politically. In this era, I mean, it's one of the things that's surprising. I think when we were there in the 90s, we sort of assumed that maybe after 20 years you would see political change. And especially, I mean, the educational change is immense, right? I mean, when I was teaching in Fuling, you had, 1 out of every 12 college-age Chinese could enter a university or a college. Very rare. You're talking about 8%. And now it's more than 50%. So most young Chinese are able to go to higher education. That's an incredible improvement. I don't think there's ever been a society that has had certainly not a populous country, that has had such a rapid improvement in education. And meanwhile, you also have the material improvement. So you kind of would expect with these changes, you would also have political changes. But if anything, the political system is tighter than it was, in a lot of ways. Like it's more repressive probably under Xi than it was back when I was teaching there. So I think that's surprising, and it's something to struggle with. As an outsider, you're wondering, is it possible for this to be a permanent situation? I'm not convinced. I mean, I don't think we can really predict, but there is a sort of tension because people have more information, they have more mobility, they have more resources, but their political space has been limited. And you wonder if that's sustainable or not. And, in the 90s, information was very limited in China, right? And I mean, we didn't, in Fuling in 1996 to 1998, we didn't have internet. None of the students had been online. They didn't have cell phones. Their materials were very limited. And they did tend to have pretty standard opinions about things or standard pieces of information. Completely different now. I mean, young Chinese, first of all, they travel, right? I mean, more than half of the passports in China are, millennials or younger. It's almost all young people who go overseas, and so they have contact with things when they do that. Young people know how to use VPN. My students from the 1990s, I did a survey a number of years ago, and I asked them, it was more than 30 of them, do you use a VPN? And only one actually did. Even though they're middle class, they're educated, it's just kind of a hassle, they don't really do it. They could figure it out, but it's not important. But the young people I taught at Sichuan University, the freshmen sometimes, the first year, they didn't yet know how, but they learned very quickly. And so by the time they're seniors, pretty much all of those students know how to access whatever information they need. And so you don't have the old situation where everybody kind of is getting the same stuff. So, sometimes I would survey my classes at Sichuan University because I wanted to do debates in class. It's a good way to get students to use English and to think. And one of the ones I thought about was gay marriage, right? And should you be able to have same-sex marriage? Should that be legal? I asked the students in a survey, so I'd get their opinions, and then I thought maybe we would do a debate about it in class. I wasn't sure if it was too sensitive. But anyway, I asked them in a private survey, and it was amazing because I think it was more than 85% of the students said, yeah, we should have same-sex. It wasn't really an issue to them. So we didn't even do the debate because it was too much on one side, But I actually asked the same question of my students from the 1990s, and it was almost exactly the opposite in that it was something like more than 85% of them were opposed. And often they would say things like, yeah, this is disgusting. This is something, we could never have this. They had these very traditional sort of outdated ideas about LGBTQ issues. And my young students at Sichuan University, they often said, yeah, this is one thing that I argue about with my parents. They don't really understand this. I tell them it's fine. I have friends who are gay, or I have friends who are bisexual, and it's not a problem. It's not something that bothers me. If people are queer, it's normal. It doesn't bother. But their parents often still had these old ideas. So you can see that was a big change, and quite impressive because I remembered in the 90s that seemed. If you had told me then that this would change in China, people's ideas, I wouldn't have thought that. At the same time, that's a change at the individual level, but look at the government. It really has cracked down on all kinds of activist groups, including LGBTQ groups, right? So a lot of them did get targeted, like many other human rights oriented or sort of, socially oriented, NGOs, they all got targeted. So the government has not been very supportive of these groups. But I do find young people at the individual level, at the personal level, they're open. I mean, it creates a tension, right? And it's inevitable that you have people are becoming more educated, they have more contact with the outside world, even directly when they travel, and yet the system that they live in is tighter and tighter. I think your instinct is that it can't sustain, that something has to change at some point. But it's hard to see, it hasn't happened so far, and it doesn't seem to be immediately on the horizon, but there are definitely signs of tension. I mean, I could tell that the young people I taught from 2019 to 2021, they're so much more aware than in the earlier generation. And they also struck me as less narrowly patriotic. I mean, I think we have this idea of young Chinese as being intensely patriotic and intensely, the Xiaofenhong, the little pinks, who are known for being, attacking people online. I found that to be a little bit exaggerated, to be honest. Like in person, teaching students, I didn't get that feeling from. There wasn't this kind of patriotic edge. There actually was more of that in the 90s, I felt like. My students in the 1990s were more narrowly patriotic, and they were more sensitive. They would get upset more easily if I talked about something that they saw as sensitive or maybe they thought was not respectful of China. I think when you have these kind of young people who are more worldly and more aware, the question is how long are they going to be happy in a system that limits their expression and limits their political involvement. Most people are not optimistic about China. I think this is a moment when most people are very pessimistic. I think I'm less pessimistic. And that's partly because my intense contact with people from the 90s that I've known for 25 years now, and also my intense contact with people that I taught in 2019 to 2021. Now when I look at the people from the 90s, actually I can't give you one example of one of those individuals who has become more closed-minded, who has become more ignorant, it's the opposite. They've become more aware, they have better information. I think they're generally more reasonable when you talk to them in terms of their opinions, and that has to make me feel a little better about the place. And when I look at the students I taught recently in 2019 and 21, I was very impressed with them, and with their abilities certainly, but also just their perspective, their judgment. Now that doesn't mean that they're going to be able to transform the system, right? Because we can see lots of ways in which systems have a way of overwhelming even the most talented individuals, even the most dedicated and most forward-thinking people. They can be crushed by systems, no question. But it does give me some cautious optimism. When I see this sort of human talent, human energy, and ability, the capability of people in China, especially young people, it makes me a little more optimistic. I also think we don't really have a model for this. That's the other thing to remember. So China, of course, is not the China of 1976 or Mao's China or something. And it's also not the Soviet Union. It's not, it's not like any other really authoritarian system in the sense that you have a very rigid authoritarian political system, but you've had huge economic improvement, you've had huge educational improvement. That's unprecedented. And you also have huge numbers of young Chinese going abroad and seeing other things, and that's also unprecedented. So we don't know where this leads. So I feel like we have to be open to all possibilities. It doesn't mean that you should, be complacent and think, oh yeah, everything's going to be fine. Obviously, this is a tough time in China, but I think there is I'm hopeful that they'll go to a better place. My wife is also a journalist. Both of us were there in the 90s and 2000s, and you knew at some level that this was a special moment and that it was an unusual moment, but I think you appreciate that more when you spend time in other countries. It's not that sort of improvement that was going on, that energy that was part of China in the 90s and the 2000s, that hasn't happened in history very often, where a country makes these rapid transformations and you've got, this massive urbanization and people leaving the countryside and people becoming educated. It doesn't happen all the time. So, I gained a better appreciation for that. I also really did admire the dedication of average Chinese, just with people's willingness to work hard. It sounds like a simple thing, but it's not, and when I see that, it's kind of at all levels of society. Like in America, I do feel like actually very well-educated Americans and sort of elite Americans are very, very hardworking. But in China, I find it goes from the top to the bottom. Like the people that are not particularly educated or just doing average jobs are really dedicated to what they're doing. I have to admire that, and it's a resource for the country. It's something that has made China what it is today. The Chinese society over the past 30 years, people have learned if you have the input, you're going to get the output. You put in the work, you get yourself better educated, better training, it's going to pay off. And that wasn't true in Egypt. Because in Egypt, people weren't motivated because they didn't see the outcome of their work. Often you could work quite hard and you couldn't make much headway. There was a level of chaos in Egypt that was kind of scary because there were, I was there during a politically unstable time, and there was a high degree of political violence, and that was sort of frightening. And you could see people getting hurt. There were, a number of journalists died actually during that period. So it's sort of a different level of risk and challenge than you have even in a Chinese system. Obviously, what I would like to see would be a more open system in both places. I think the thing, though, that Egypt was lacking, that I often wrote about, was they had a lot of this political change on the surface in the sense of, Mubarak was removed from power, and then Morsi came into power, and then Morsi was removed from power, and Sisi came to. So you have political change on the very surface, but it wasn't creating social change, economic change, educational change. So those things I admired about what China at least had those things going on. Like, look at the status of women in China over the past 50 years, and you would say that it has definitely improved. More women working, people in the countryside who used to look down on girl children, that had changed a lot by the 2000s even because of the success of young women in the factory economy. And then you look at education and the immense numbers of Chinese who are now better educated than ever before. Egypt wasn't making those kind of changes. And so that at least is a good thing, right? So when we look at China, there's a lot of things that we're disappointed with and that we would like to see change, right? We would like to see more political involvement by people. We would like to see protections of basic human rights and protection of political expression. We don't want to see this sort of repressive environment that we've had under Xi Jinping. But at least you have had some of these economic improvements, educational improvements, and they matter. It does matter, and it makes me more optimistic about China's path in the future. Whereas in Egypt, I found it hard to be optimistic about the future there because you just didn't see a system that was able to improve people's lives significantly. When I went there in the 90s, I was sent by the Peace Corps, and the Peace Corps did a fabulous job of taking Americans from all different kinds of backgrounds and putting them in China. And some of us really thrived and connected and became people who worked with China for a long time. They also had the Fulbright program, which would send young Americans and older Americans, American scholars, to go to research things in China and Hong Kong. And both of those programs have been cut off, and that was a decision of the American government, by the Trump administration. So, to me, this is not in America's best interest. It makes no sense. We need to understand China, and even if we don't care about China, we need to know. Even if you are wary of China or you're worried about China, that's fine. You need to have the information, and we're not getting the information because we're losing a generation of China specialists. So I think it's really a crisis. They need to find ways to get young people there. I think this most recent, there's something like 1,000 American students studying in China, and there's almost 300,000 Chinese students here. The Chinese are here. They're learning about America. They're learning how to engage with the society as they should. We should be doing the same thing there. So we need to really focus on that and find ways. They should never have canceled the Peace Corps. They never should have canceled the Fulbright program, and they should try to bring back things like that if they can. Decoupling is kind of a fantasy, at this point. The connections are so tight between these countries, and the economies are so, in this most recent period when I lived in Chengdu, I wrote about an entrepreneur. He sold shoes on Amazon. So he was selling very inexpensive running shoes on Amazon to American consumers. And that connection was so close that when the Trump administration sent out the stimulus checks to American citizens, this guy in Chengdu could see the impact immediately. He could tell. And even one time I visited him, he said, yeah, they just sent out more checks. And I said, no, they didn't send out more checks. They did one round. And he said, no, I could tell. My sales reflected it. And then like the next day I found out that they had, I had one in my home in Colorado. They had gone back and sent money to people who hadn't received it the first time. And he knew that already. He could tell. And he had never been to America. He had good written English, but he didn't really speak English that well. We always communicated in Chinese. And he had never been to the United States, but his business was so tightly connected to the United States that those political things immediately had an impact on him. So it's a weird situation because you have these economies that are really deeply intertwined, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we understand each other better, And that's kind of the question. You need the personal contact to do that. So you need to have people talking to each other, communicating. That's one reason why you need the hard work of people going there and learning Chinese. Just like the Chinese who do the hard work of learning English and coming to the United States, those things are important and it needs to be going in both directions.